The morning she almost died the first time Sloane Carter was counting heartbeats. Not her own. Caleb Whitmore's. She had two fingers pressed against the inside of his wrist during the pre-mission medical check, watching the second hand on her father's old Timex, the one Frank Carter had worn through two deployments in a marriage and given to her the morning she shipped out from Dayton. With one bag and no ceremony. 62 beats per minute, strong, steady. The young Marine didn't know she was also checking his color, his breathing the slight tremble in his jaw that told her he hadn't slept more than 3 hours. She cataloged all of it without expression, the way a pilot checks instruments before takeoff. Not because she was worried, because this was what she did. She did not know yet that the number 14 would follow her for the rest of her life. Not as a wound count, not as a casualty figure. As something closer to an answer to a question she had not yet learned to ask about what a person left behind when the work was finished and whether it was enough and how you measured enough in a profession that dealt exclusively in the distance between living and not. 14. The date, the students, the meaning she would spend years assembling from pieces she did not yet possess. She had none of this yet. She just pressed two fingers against a 19-year-old's wrist and counted. "You're good, Whitmore," she said. He exhaled. "Thanks, Doc." He was 19 years old. He had a photograph of a girl named Jess tucked behind the ceramic plate in his chest carrier, directly over his heart, which Sloane thought was either the most romantic thing she had encountered in 6 months of deployment or the most tactically unsound, depending on which part of her brain was running the assessment. She moved to the next man. The date was October 14th, 2004. The city was Fallujah. The temperature at 0630 was already 81 degrees and climbing toward 109, the kind of dry furnace heat that turned the inside of a man's mouth to chalk and made distances shimmer and lie. Sloane had been in Iraq for 6 months. She had stopped noticing the heat the way people stop noticing the sound of traffic outside their window. It was simply the condition of existence here. You adapted or you didn't. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 118 pounds, which meant that the medical pack she carried 42 pounds of trauma supplies, IV fluids, hemostatic agents, surgical instruments, and enough morphine to run a small emergency room, weighed more than a third of her body. She carried it the way she carried everything else, without complaint, without drawing attention to it. What she could not carry without drawing attention was herself. She was the only woman in the squad. Corporal Declan Pruitt noticed her existence the way a man notices a stone in his boot. Not dangerous, not interesting, but persistently present in a way that complicated his movement. He was 27, built like a loading dock, and possessed the professional confidence of someone who had never yet been proven decisively wrong about anything that mattered. He waited until Sergeant Garrett Voss was within earshot before he said it. "Why is Doc running a clearing op with us?" He didn't say it to her. He said it to the air in front of him, which was a particular kind of dismissal that required no direct confrontation. Sloane heard it. She kept moving towards Sergeant Amos Kerrigan, who was sitting on a concrete step and with his helmet between his knees and his eyes closed. Voss didn't look up from the mission brief. "She goes where the squad goes, Pruitt." "I know that, sir. I'm asking why that's the policy. Clearing ops aren't medical calls. She's a corpsman. She patches people up. Why is she walking in with us instead of stage 200 meters back?" Voss folded the paper. He was 38 years old and had the kind of face that had been weathered into something permanent, like a fence post that had survived every season and stopped trying to look like anything other than what it was. He had run medical support teams for 6 years. He had also watched a corpsman freeze at the wrong moment in Ramadi 18 months ago, and a Marine had bled out in a courtyard because of it. He didn't say any of that. He looked at Pruitt and said, "Because I want her close." It wasn't an answer that satisfied Pruitt. He worked his jaw once, then let it go. Sloane crouched in front of Kerrigan and put 2 fingers to his neck. Kerrigan opened one eye. He was 44, a Gulf War veteran, and had the particular stillness of a man who had learned long ago that most problems resolve themselves if you watch them long enough. His pulse was elevated. His skin was dry in a way that skin shouldn't be after a full night's rest. She looked at the color beneath his lower lip. "Kerrigan, when did you last drink water?" "Last night sometime." "That's not an answer." He opened the other eye. 1900 hours. She had already pulled a leader bag from her pack and was connecting the line. "Give me your arm." "I'm fine, Doc." "Your pulse is 98 and your mucous membranes are the color of chalk. You're running a quart low and we haven't even left the wire." She found the vein in his forearm on the first stick, taped the line down, and hung the bag from the antenna housing of the vehicle behind him. "You drink all of this before we move out or I pull you from the roster myself." Kerrigan looked at the IV bag. Then he looked at her with an expression that was not amusement and not dismissal. It was something quieter and more careful. The recognition, perhaps, of a particular kind of competence that did not announce itself. "Yes, ma'am," he said. From across the courtyard, Pruitt watched this exchange. He said nothing, but something shifted in his face the way a card moved from one hand to another, barely perceptible, not yet meaningful, but registered. The briefing lasted 20 minutes. The Squad 12 Marines plus Sloan gathered in the shade of a damaged vehicle depot while Voss walked them through the objective. A residential sector in the northeastern grid, 4 city blocks. House-to-house search for weapons caches and intelligence materials connected to a cell operating in the area. The sector had been quiet for 4 days. In Fallujah, quiet was not peace. Quiet was a held breath. Sloan stood at the back of the group and listened with the forward part of her attention while the rest of it was doing something else. She was watching the interpreter who stood at Voss's left shoulder, a local man named Nasser, who had been working with the unit for 3 months. There was nothing overtly wrong. He was translating correctly, standing in the right place, performing his function. But his stillness was different from Kerrigan's stillness. Kerrigan was still because he was at rest. Nasser was still because he was performing being at rest. The difference was small and specific, and she could not have explained it in language that would have satisfied an intelligence analyst. She held it. She moved on. Warren Fitch, corporal, 31 years old, father of 2 daughters named Maggie and Ruth, was standing to her right. He had 11 days left in his deployment. He had told her this the previous morning, over bad coffee, the way soldiers told you things they needed to say aloud to make real. 11 days. His wife had already booked the restaurant. His younger daughter had drawn him a picture of a house with a yellow door and mailed it in an envelope with 17 stamps, which had made him laugh in a way that changed his whole face. He showed her the drawing, now briefly folded in his breast pocket, the way men showed you things they couldn't speak about directly. She looked at the yellow door. "Nice house," she said. "Yeah," he said. He put it away. They moved out at 07:30. The streets of Fallujah in October had a particular quality of light, hard, flat, unforgiving, that bleached color from everything, and left the world looking like a photograph that had been left too long in the sun. The squad moved in a staggered column through alleys barely wide enough for 2 men abreast, past walls pocked with old bullet holes, past metal gates painted the kind of blue that faded into gray before it had a chance to be beautiful. Sloan moved 3 positions back from the point man. She had calculated this herself in her 3rd week in Fallujah, with a stopwatch and a measured stretch of wall close enough to reach the front of the column in under 10 seconds, far enough back to have a half-second of warning before contact. Nobody had asked her to do this. She had done it because it was the kind of preparation that saved lives, and saving lives was the only mathematics she was interested in. She was watching the neighborhood. Not for weapons, not for tactical threats. She was watching it the way a physician watched a patient, looking for vital signs, for the presence or absence of things that should be there. There were no children. In a residential sector at 800 on a weekday, in a neighborhood with an estimated civilian population of 400, there should have been children. There should have been the particular morning chaos of domestic life, women in doorways, old men in plastic chairs, the sound of a television through a wall somewhere. There was none of it. The street was geometrically empty. The windows were dark behind their coverings. The gates were closed. Even the dogs were gone, which was the detail that settled it for her because dogs in this city were not controllable by human request. Sloan moved up the column until she was at Voss's shoulder. "Sergeant." He glanced at her without breaking stride. "This neighborhood is presenting like a population under acute threat response. No ambient activity at an hour when there should be considerable ambient activity. No children, no open windows, no dogs." She kept her voice low and precise. "This pattern is consistent with people who have been told to stay inside and stay quiet. Someone warned them we were coming." Voss held the column with a raised fist. He looked at the street ahead. He was a careful man, and what she had said registered somewhere behind his eyes. But they had a mission brief developed by intelligence analysts with access to information neither of them possessed, and 4 blocks to clear, and a report due at 1400. "Stay sharp," he said, to the column, not to her. He lowered his fist. They moved forward. Sloan fell back to her position. She began laying out her trauma priorities in her mind, not listing equipment, but sequencing interventions in the order that survivable injuries typically required them. This was not pessimism. It was the same preparation a surgeon made before opening a patient. Her hands rested on the shoulder straps of her pack. Her eyes kept moving. They were halfway down the second block when she noticed it. In the third-floor window of the corner building, a flat, unremarkable structure with the kind of anonymous urban face that could have been any building in any city, the shadow at the left window was wrong. Shadows move with light. This one had the fixed, deliberate quality of something that had chosen its position. She was 2 seconds from speaking when the world came apart. The first shots came from the northeast rooftop, then the building to the south, then the alley behind them, which meant someone had allowed them to pass deliberately and close the exit after. This was not the ragged, opportunistic fire of men who had seen a patrol and grabbed their weapons. The fields of fire overlapped with the precision of a plan that had been drawn on paper and rehearsed. Every angle of the street was covered. Every doorway was a kill zone. In the first 3 seconds, Sloan understood the full picture. The absence of children, the closed windows, Nasser's performed stillness. The ambush that had waited 4 days for them to walk into it, 4 days of quiet that was not quiet but preparation, was the product of someone who had studied how American units moved through this city with the patience and specificity of professional planning. Warren Fitch dropped in the second volley. He was to her left and slightly ahead, and she saw it happen, the impact, the way his body understood what had happened before his mind did, the particular collapse that looked nothing like sleep and nothing like theater. She moved toward him on reflex, and then she heard it, Caleb Whitmore's voice, from the right in the register she had learned in 6 months to identify immediately. Not fear, damage. She stopped. She had half a second to make a decision she would carry for the rest of her life. Warren Fitch had gone down without a sound, without a hand reaching out. Caleb Whitmore was producing sound, which meant he was conscious, which meant there was still an interval in which action could alter the outcome. She made the calculation in one breath with the precision her training had built into her, and the honesty her training had also built into her, because triage logic was not a feeling, and it was not cruelty. It was the only mathematics that worked in this space. She ran toward Caleb, 50 meters of open street. She ran in the broken, unpredictable pattern her father had made her practice in the yard behind their house in Dayton when she was 16, not a zigzag because a zigzag was a pattern, and patterns could be tracked, but something more irregular, moving on instinct, rather than geometry, making herself a problem to solve, rather than a target to lead. The first round hit her in the left shoulder. She felt it as impact and heat and the spreading numbness that meant her body was managing the information on her behalf. She adjusted her weight. She kept running. She was 20 meters out when she saw what Caleb had done. He was on the ground on his right side, both arms wrapped around a child Iraqi no more than 4 years old, using his entire body as a shield. He had taken 3 rounds doing it. She could see entry wounds in his left shoulder, his abdomen, his right leg. The child was alive and uninjured and producing a sound that cut through the gunfire the way children's voices always did, which was one of the true and merciless constants of combat. Sloan reached them. She went to her knees and the impact sent pain up through both legs, and she filed the pain behind a closed door and turned the key. She assessed Caleb in 7 seconds. The abdominal wound was the priority. The leg was bleeding fast. The shoulder could wait. She opened her pack and found the hemostatic gauze by texture and shape. Without looking, and packed the abdominal wound with the steady, firm pressure her instructors at Portsmouth had made her practice until her wrists ached. Caleb, she said. She used his first name deliberately. Stay with me. He opened his eyes, pale blue like water at depth. I got her, he said. He was still holding the child. I know you did. Let go now. I have her. His arms released. The child ran. She was through a gate and gone from the story in 4 seconds. Sloan did not watch her leave. She was already applying a tourniquet to Caleb's right leg 4 inches above the wound, tightening until he made a sound, then one more click past that. The second round hit her in the right thigh. Different from the shoulder had been clean in and out soft tissue. This one sat. She tightened the tourniquet 3 more clicks and planted both knees harder against the ground and kept working. She had an IV line in Caleb's left arm in 40 seconds. She was establishing a second line when Pruitt's voice came from behind a vehicle to her left. Doc, get down, you're completely exposed. Suppressive fire northwest corner, 3rd floor, she said without raising her voice. I need 30 seconds. There was a pause that lasted approximately 1 second. Then she heard the firing pattern shift as Pruitt and 2 others redirected their aim to the northwest corner building. She had 30 seconds. She used 28 of them. As she worked, she became aware in the methodical and slightly distant way of someone taking inventory under pressure of a 3rd impact to her left arm that was shrapnel rather than a direct round, and a 4th at her lower right side that she would not fully account for until later. She noted each one the way she would note an instrument reading present, filed, addressed in sequence. Her hands continued without interruption. She talked to Caleb while she worked. She talked to him about Jess because he had shown her the photograph the morning before, and she understood that the girl in that photograph was the correct thing to aim his attention toward. She talked in the level, unhurried tone she used for all patient communication, which was neither falsely cheerful nor grimly honest, but simply present the voice of someone who had decided that this moment was not going to end a certain way and was communicating that decision directly. He was slipping towards shock. His color was wrong, and his pulse was running faster than it should, the body's attempt to compensate for lost volume by increasing the rate. She maintained the IV fluid and kept her palm flat against the abdominal packing and counted his breaths. The volume of fire was changing. Something was happening at the perimeter. She could hear the shift in trajectory, the suggestion of a different engagement opening somewhere to the north, which meant either the situation was deteriorating or a relief force was fighting its way toward them. She could not afford to look up and assess this. She kept her hands where they were. "You're going to be okay," she told Caleb. It was not a diagnosis. It was a decision. He closed his eyes, and for one terrible second, she thought she had lost him, and then his chest rose and his pulse came back under her fingers, and she allowed herself one full breath. The relief force arrived 18 minutes after first contact. 18 minutes in a firefight was a geological era. Long enough for character to become entirely clear, for every piece of training to either hold or fail, for the distance between who you believed yourself to be and who you actually were to be measured precisely. Sloan spent those 18 minutes on her knees in an open street. When the first medic from the relief force came around the damaged vehicle and stopped, he spent several seconds taking in the scene before he spoke. He looked at the IV lines, the tourniquet, the packed wounds, the organized sequence of interventions that surrounded Caleb Whitmore like the evidence of a very specific kind of dedication. Then he looked at her. "Ma'am," he said, "you've been hit." Sloan became aware in the clinical and slightly remote manner of someone examining a problem they had been deliberately not examining, that her left arm had gone mostly numb, that her right leg was carrying her weight in a compensated way that would become very uncomfortable very soon, and that the front of her uniform was almost entirely red, very little of which was her own blood. She looked down at herself. 4 wounds. She had counted 4. She had known about all of them. There was a 5th, the medic would tell her later, lower right side. She had apparently missed it in the count. "Take him first," she said. The medic looked at her for a moment longer than the situation professionally required. Then he turned to Caleb. Declan Pruitt appeared from behind the vehicle to her left. There was plaster dust in his hair and a laceration above his right eye he had not addressed. He looked at Sloan. He looked at the 50 meters of open street between the vehicle and where she knelt unmarked except for a scatter of brass casings and the dark stain that recorded the previous hour. His face was doing the specific work of a person who had been wrong about something significant and was processing the full weight of this in real time. He did not say anything. Amos Kerrigan materialized at Sloane's right shoulder with the quiet inevitability of a man who occupied the spaces between things. He looked at her wounds with the practiced assessment of a soldier who had seen enough of them to read them quickly. He did not ask how she was. He did not tell her she was fine. He picked up her medical pack from the ground where it had fallen during the engagement, checked that nothing had spilled, and held it out to her. She took it. Warren Fitch had been dead before he hit the ground. She allowed herself to know this now, standing in the thin shade of a blast wall while the relief force secured the sector. The particular quality of his fall, the absence of the reaching that living bodies did, even when badly hurt. She had understood it in the 2 seconds before she had turned and run toward Caleb, and she had made the correct decision, and she would spend a long time afterward understanding that correct decisions did not feel like correct decisions in the moment they were made. They felt like choices that cost something real and permanent, made under conditions that did not allow for the luxury of knowing you were right. She sat on the ground with her back against the wall. She took her father's Timex off her wrist, checked the crystal for cracks out of habit, and put it back on. In 11 days, Warren Fitch had been supposed to go home, to a restaurant his wife had already booked, to a drawing of a house with a yellow door. She sat with that for exactly as long as she could afford to, which was not long at all. Then she stood up and shouldered her pack because there were still people in this sector who were alive and needed her, and staying seated was not something she had come to this city to do. She began the triage walk. She moved through the sector with the same systematic attention she brought to everything, checking each man she passed, color breathing the angles of their limbs, cataloging, assessing moving, first to the ones who needed her most urgently, then to the ones who needed her next. Her leg was conducting a serious and increasingly insistent conversation with her nervous system about priorities. She told it to wait. Her father's watch said 0922. The morning was not finished with her yet. The field hospital at the forward operating base was a series of connected canvas structures that smelled of antiseptic and generator exhaust, and the particular metallic undertone that Sloan had learned in 6 months to stop registering consciously. She had been here before as the person doing the work. This was the first time she had been here as the person on the table, and she found she did not care for the reversal. The surgeon was a Navy lieutenant commander named Hargrove, who had the efficient, minimal manner of someone who had performed this category of work too many times to find it extraordinary. He worked through her wounds in a sequence she would have chosen herself, thigh first for blood loss. Priority, then shoulder, then the left arm, shrapnel 2 fragments, then the lower right side that she had not fully counted in the street. 5, Hargrove said, not looking up from his work. I counted 4. There's one at your right flank you probably didn't register because of the thigh. She thought about this. I was occupied. He glanced up at her face for a moment in the way surgeons looked at patients when they were deciding how much professional credit to extend. Then he went back to work. None of the 5 wounds were critical. He said this with the flat inflection of a weather report, and she understood he meant it technically rather than consolingly. None had reached arterial structures. None had caused pneumothorax or organ damage. The thigh wound had left a fragment she would carry for the rest of her life because its location made removal riskier than retention. He told her this the way you told a person their car would require a permanent repair to function correctly. Light duty for tow. When can I return to the squad? He set down his instrument. He was deciding whether this was a negotiation or a discussion about reality. 2 weeks minimum. 10 days, she said. I'll accept 10 days. He looked at her chart. He looked at her face, which gave him no purchase on the possibility of managing her expectations. He said 10 days. If the thigh closes correctly and there's no infection. She nodded. They did not speak again. She slept for 11 hours, which was more consecutive sleep than she had managed in any single stretch since arriving in Iraq. She did not bring any dreams back with her into the morning. She woke to aircraft sound and bad coffee smell and lay for a few seconds on the cot looking at the canvas overhead, letting herself be a body in a bed with no immediate obligations. Then she put on her father's watch and went to file her reports. The communications tent was quiet at that hour except for Specialist Delaney, who was finishing a 20-hour shift with the particular focused efficiency of someone running on will alone. He gave her the information in clipped sentences. Caleb Whitmore had been airlifted to the military hospital in Baghdad at 13:40 the previous afternoon. He had arrived alive and gone directly into surgery. Status at last report critical but stable, which in Baghdad's trauma system meant the surgeons believed the mathematics were running in his favor. 2 other squad members had been evacuated with serious wounds. 4 had been treated at the FOB and returned to duty. The formal casualty entries were documented in the standard language that did not accommodate yellow doors or restaurant bookings or 11 days. Sloan read the entry for Warren Fitch 3 times. She made certain she could carry what it said before she left the tent. Voss was at the small folding table outside the operations room, reading the previous day's intelligence summary with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The bandage on his left forearm was the color of old linen. He looked up when she sat down across from him and read her face the way he read everything, looking for what wasn't being said. You should still be in recovery, he said. Reports needed filing. He let this stand because he was practical. Whitmore's going to make it, she said. Yes, he set down the intelligence summary. He gave her the full accounting without her having to ask for it. 3 others treated and returned to duty. Pruitt with shrapnel across his back that would keep him off clearing ops for a month. Corporal Paulson transferred to Landstuhl the previous afternoon. Voss had a 16-stitch laceration on his left forearm that he declined to discuss. She did the arithmetic. She was accustomed to the arithmetic by now. It did not get it easier. It got more familiar, which was a different kind of thing entirely. Voss reached into the front pocket of his blouse and set an envelope on the table between them. It was a standard personal letter envelope, slightly creased from being carried against a ceramic plate. The front had no address, no postage. 3 words in careful, deliberate handwriting. For my girls. She looked at Voss. Found it in his breast pocket during the casualty process, Voss said. There was a second note inside, folded separately. It had your name on it. He placed an index card on the table. She opened it. 7 words in the same careful hand Carter will know what to say. Trust her. She sat with the card for a long time. The coffee smell and the generator noise and the distant sound of vehicles moving toward the gate were unchanged by the fact of those 7 words, which was one of the strange properties of significant moments. The world made no adjustment to indicate that something had shifted. He wrote this before the mission, she said. Yes. He barely knew me. Voss looked at his hands. He'd been in this unit for 11 months. He had time to learn who was in it. A pause. He picked you. She folded the index card along its original crease and placed it in her breast pocket beside the letter from her father that she had been carrying unread since she shipped out, saving it for a day when she would need it more than she needed it now. That day had not yet arrived, but it was closer than it had been. I'll write to his wife, she said. I know you will. They sat in the early morning without talking. The cold coffee, the folded paper, the base assembling itself around them for another day of work in a city that was not finished with any of them. The phone call came that evening. She was in the medical tent restocking her trauma pack from the unit's supply, replacing what she had used, evaluating what had survived, re-examining each item with the hands-on attention she gave to equipment that had been tested under real conditions. This was work she had done 100 times, and it carried the quality that repetitive, necessary work sometimes had of being almost meditative in its demands. Each item had a place. Each place had a reason. The reason for every reason was legible to her, which meant the work was never merely mechanical. It was the physical expression of a system of thought she had spent years building and continued to refine. The communications specialist came to the door and told her there was a call from the States on the secure line. He said it in the careful, uninflected tone of someone who had been specifically instructed not to editorialize, which told her what she needed to know before she picked up the receiver. Dr. Emmett Walsh Dayton, a medical center. He was thorough with his language in the way physicians were when they were managing the territory between bad news and worse news. Frank Carter had been admitted 2 days ago. The lung cancer that had been held at a managed plateau for 14 months had begun to move. There was fluid. There were other clinical specifics after that which she received in the flat processing manner of someone reading a language they spoke fluently but were taking in too fast. She asked 3 questions. She received 3 answers. She thanked Dr. Walsh and placed the receiver down. She stood in the medical tent with her hands at her sides. Everything in the pack was exactly where it was supposed to be. Everything was in its correct sequence. The base was doing what it always did at this hour, the particular diminishment of operational tempo that was not quiet but was less than the day, a collective breath before tomorrow. She stood without moving for a period of time she could not afterward account for. Amos Kerrigan came through the tent entrance. He had not passed through on his way to something else. He had come directly here at this hour for reasons he was not going to state. He looked at her face once and then did not look at it again. He sat down on the supply crate to her left. He reached into his cargo pocket and produced a cup of coffee which he placed on the edge of the table beside her pack. The cup was hot. He had timed it precisely. She looked at the coffee. She picked it up. My father is sick, she said. The reporting tone came out automatically. He's at the VA in Dayton. It's moving now. It's been stable for 14 months and now it's moving. Kerrigan did not respond immediately. He was looking at the tent wall with the observational stillness of a man who understood that the most useful thing he could offer was the weight of his presence without the burden of his opinion. He gave me this watch, she said. She held out her wrist. He looked at the Timex without leaning forward, taking it in from where he sat. 2 deployments. He wore it through both of them and gave it to me the morning I shipped out. Kerrigan was quiet for another moment. Then he taught you well. 4 words. She turned them over and understood that he had chosen them with the precision he brought to everything and that they contained the full scope of what he wanted to say. He did, she said. They sat in the tent with the coffee going gradually less hot and the base conducting its evening outside, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had worked beside each other in serious circumstances and had arrived without ceremony at the particular kind of mutual regard that did not require filling. After a while, she said, "Thank you for the coffee." He stood up. He left without additional comment, which was exactly correct. Lieutenant Commander Hollis Crane arrived at the Ford operating base 3 days after the engagement. He was 46 medium height with close-cut gray hair and the physical economy of a body maintained strictly for function. He carried no unit insignia she could immediately identify, and he moved through the base with the directional certainty of someone who had studied the layout before arriving. He went first to the operations room and second to the medical tent. He introduced himself with rank and name and sat down across from her and placed a printed copy of her supplemental engagement documentation on the table between them. "You filed a pre-contact observation report," he said. "Physiological indicators of mass civilian concealment, approximately 4 minutes before first shots." "Yes, sir." "You also noted an anomalous radio fragment during the engagement, possible non-standard channel traffic." She had almost excluded this. It had been 2 seconds of static and a half-heard voice, and she had written it with the appropriate qualifying language possible, unconfirmed insufficient data for characterization. She had included it because incomplete intelligence was still intelligence, and she had been trained to report what she observed rather than what she was confident about. "Yes, sir." Crane folded the report along a clean vertical crease. He looked at her with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, but simply very focused. "What I'm about to tell you is classified. It is not to be discussed outside authorized channels." "Understood, sir." He told her about Nasser. He told it with the efficient precision of someone who had briefed this material before and made long ago the decision about how much to include. Nasser had been identified as an intelligence source for an insurgent network 11 weeks ago. Not by chance. By the patient methodical work of correlating patrol routes with contact incidents over months until the overlap became undeniable. The cell he had been providing information to was the cell responsible for the engagement on October 14th. Nasser had known the route, the timing, the composition of the patrol. He had provided this information at minimum twice in the preceding month. He had been arrested 48 hours before the ambush. Sloan went still. 48 hours before, she said. Yes. She looked at the table. She completed the calculation without assistance and looked back at Crane. You needed them to commit to the operation before you removed him. You needed the network to deploy so you could identify the full structure. Crane did not confirm this. He also did not deny it. He held the silence for the time it required and then said, the intelligence value of identifying the full network exceeded the value of his immediate detention. She understood the structure of that calculus. She had done triage. She knew what it meant to prioritize one thing over another when you could not have both. She did not have to find it acceptable in order to understand it. Warren Fitch had walked into a street that someone with full knowledge had watched him walk toward. She thought about the yellow door. She kept her hands flat on the table. Why are you telling me this? She said. Crane looked at her steadily. Because you already knew half of it and were working toward the rest. The observation report, the radio fragment. You were connecting information that analysts with complete signals access didn't fully connect until 2 days later. He paused. I'm telling you the rest because I need you to understand the complete picture and because the operation we're planning requires that understanding. She waited. An individual we designate as the architect, Crane said. Operational planner for the network that ran the October 14th engagement. Responsible for 14 separate attacks against coalition forces in this region over the past 7 months. Currently located at a compound outside the city with high-confidence intelligence support. He placed his hands flat on the table, a gesture that mirrored hers. My team goes in Friday at 0200. I want you with us. As medical support. As medical support, he confirmed. And because you have the clearest observational record of his operational methodology of anyone currently available to me. You were inside his operation before the first shot was fired. I want that perspective on the ground. Sloan looked at the report between them. She looked at her father's watch. She thought about Caleb Whitmore counting ceiling tiles in a Baghdad hospital. She thought about Warren Fitch's 7 words. She thought about the radio fragment she had held without fully examining the voice that had made her go still in an active firefight because it was wrong in a specific way she had not yet had time to define. Friday, she said. 0200. I'll be ready. She wrote the letter to Warren Fitch's wife that night. She sat at the small desk in the recovery tent with her pack on the floor beside her and her father's watch on the table, and she wrote by hand on plain paper without drafting because she had found over the years that the first version of difficult communications was usually the honest version, and revision tended to sand away honesty in favor of something more comfortable. She wrote about the yellow door drawing which he had shown her the morning before the engagement. She wrote about the way he had said 11 days with a particular weight on the number as if saying it aloud made it more real, more certain. She wrote that he had been present and calm and professional in every way she had observed. She wrote that the manner of his death was consistent with the manner of his life, that he had been exactly where he had committed to be doing exactly what he had committed to do. She wrote, "He left a note with your name on it and mine. He trusted me to speak to you accurately. I will try to be worthy of that trust." She did not write about the calculations she had made in the street. She did not write about the 2 seconds of triage logic that had sent her running in one direction rather than the other. That was hers to carry. She had made a correct decision in an impossible situation, and she would not make it into someone else's weight. She sealed the envelope. She looked at the unread letter in her breast pocket. The one from her father, written before Kandahar, carried since the morning she shipped out. She had been saving it for a day when she would need it more. She could feel that day approaching with the specific, recognizable pressure of something that was going to happen regardless of whether she was ready. She put it back. She lay down on the cot and placed her hands flat on her sternum and felt her own heartbeat under her palms. 61 beats per minute, strong, steady. Friday was 2 days away. She closed her eyes. 3 nights before she left Fallujah, Sloane Carter sat on the edge of her cot in the dark of the recovery tent and counted on her fingers the number of times she had been certain she was about to die. She reached for the street, the stretch behind the damaged car, the mortar round that had landed close enough to ring her ears for 2 days in a moment in a compound she had not yet experienced, but which she understood with the particular foreknowledge of someone who had been paying careful attention to probabilities, was coming and stopped. Not because she had exhausted the occasions, because she understood that this was not a useful exercise. The occasions had happened or they were coming, and she had moved through each of them with her hands still working and her judgment intact. The count was not the point. The point was Friday. She put her father's watch on her wrist and lay back down. They left the wire at 01:45 on a Friday morning, which meant the city was at its deepest darkness in its most provisional quiet. Sloane rode in the third vehicle between two SEAL operators whose names she had been given once and had not yet used. This was how they worked, she had come to understand in the 36 hours since Crane had introduced her to the team. They operated inside a discipline of a reduced social friction function over biography, demonstrated competence, overstated background. They had been observing her since her arrival. She had not tried to be observed. She had done her job, which was the only approach she knew. The pre-mission medical checks had identified a stress fracture in one operator's left foot, weeks in development managed with anti-inflammatories, and the particular stubbornness of men who had learned to work around physical limitation. She had told Crane the operator could go on the mission, but that she would monitor the foot and flag any development she assessed as compromising his mobility. Crane had looked at the operator had looked at his foot and said nothing. Crane had said understood. The other operators had registered this exchange. She had felt the quality of their attention change, not warmly, not with any social expression, but in the way professionals registered other professionals, which was the only registration that mattered in the kind of work they shared. Amos Kerrigan was in the second vehicle and serving as Marine liaison. He had come to stand beside her at the vehicles before departure, and for a moment they had simply existed in the same space, him looking at the compound where the team was assembling, her checking the organization of her pack, with her hands, both of them conducting their final assessments in the manner that was natural to them. He looked at her left shoulder, which she had been compensating for all week. The compensation was subtle, a slight adjustment in how she carried the pack, a degree of favoring that she had worked to eliminate and clearly had not eliminated sufficiently because Kerrigan saw it in the first 5 seconds. She looked back at him. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached into his breast pocket and produced a card which he held out to her. She took it and read it in the available light, a name, a phone number, and below that 4 words in Kerrigan's precise handwriting for the next ones. She looked up. "Curriculum coordinator at Naval Medical Portsmouth," he said. "She's been trying to build an integrated combat casualty course for 2 years. Can't find an instructor who's done the actual work." He paused. "You've done the work." She looked at the card. "I'm a corpsman Kerrigan, not an instructor." He considered this with the unhurried patience he brought to all assessments. "You told me I was a quart low and made me sit down before a combat operation, and I sat down without argument." Another pause. "You're an instructor." She put the card in her breast pocket beside her father's letter and the index card from Warren Fitch. He returned to his vehicle. She boarded hers. The base receded behind them, and the city moved toward them through the windscreen, and she watched it approach and adjusted her pack and thought about the 14 students she did not yet know she was going to teach. The compound was 4 kilometers outside the wire set against a rise of ground that offered natural defensive advantage on 3 sides. Crane had walked her through the satellite imagery the previous afternoon, pointing out the 3 structures within the perimeter wall and the 2 guard positions that thermal imaging had consistently identified. The compound had the functional, sufficient construction of a place that existed to serve a purpose, rather than to announce one, which told her something about the people who used it. They dismounted 600 meters out. The remaining distance was covered on foot through the specific darkness of open ground outside a populated area, not the absence of light, but something older with texture and depth. The operators moved through it without sound, each footfall placed with the deliberate weight-distributing care of men who had performed this in enough different countries that the technique had become architectural rather than conscious. Sloane matched their pace. She kept her breathing even and low. She thought about nothing except the ground in front of her and the distance to the compound wall. They reached the perimeter at 0231. The breach was simultaneous at 3 points. From the outside, it was a compression of sound and directed movement that lasted less than 4 seconds and left her inside the compound walls before her body had fully processed the transition. The operators cleared the first structure. The controlled, suppressed sound of their weapons gave way to the particular silence that followed decisive brief contact. She moved to the staging position Crane had designated the interior wall of the central courtyard and opened her pack with both hands in the dark, her fingers reading the organization she had built into it by touch rather than sight. The pack was arranged not by size or category, but by the sequence in which people died, which was to say, by the order in which she would need each thing when the time came. She had arranged it this way for 2 years. She had never arrived at a situation where the order was wrong. The first seal came out of the second structure, moving incorrectly. She saw it before he said her name, the way his right leg was bearing too much weight, the forward lean that spoke of something being protected on his left side. She was already moving toward him when he spoke. His name was Rutherford. 31 years old, compact and self-contained, with the physical efficiency of someone who had spent a decade being extremely difficult to kill. He was bleeding from his left thigh, a fragment wound that had opened the lateral muscle without reaching the femoral artery, which was the precise margin between an injury and a death. He sat down where she directed him without negotiation, which told her he had worked with corpsmen enough to understand this was not a situation that accommodated debate. "Femoral's clear," she said, assessing the wound. "I checked," he said. "Then you know you're going to close and walk out of here." He watched her hands, which were moving through the wound with the same steady, unremarkable efficiency they moved through everything. "You always work like this." She applied hemostatic gauze with firm, even pressure. "Hold this, both hands. Don't release until I tell you." He held it. She was placing the IV line when the activity in the third structure shifted in character, the sound of directed movement becoming the sound of controlled containment, which was the sound of the mission reaching its objective. She capped the line, assessed Rutherford's color and pulse, told him he was going to be fine and that she would return in 4 minutes, and stood. She picked up her pack. She walked toward the third structure. Crane was in the doorway. He stepped back without comment and let her through. The room was a ground floor interior with no windows and a single overhead bulb that gave everything the flat, merciless light of a space designed for function rather than comfort. 3 men were on the floor being processed by 2 operators. A 4th man sat separately in a wooden chair. 2 operators stood behind him. Crane stood to his left. A field medical kit lay open on the floor untouched. This was the architect. He was 43 years old, younger than she had expected, lean in the way of men who were always in motion. His hands showed the kind of work that did not come from offices, and his face showed the kind of thought that did not come from impulsive decisions. He had been shot once through the upper left arm. The humerus was broken. She could see the angle from across the room, and once along the right side of his ribs, a grazing wound that looked more serious than it was. He was managing significant pain with a stillness that she recognized immediately as trained discipline. He was not performing stoicism. He had built it over years into structure. He looked at her when she entered the room. She crossed to him and crouched beside the open field kit. She worked without introduction because there was nothing to introduce. This was the work. She assessed the arm first. The broken humerus was the more critical of the 2 injuries and required immobilization before transport, if he was going to arrive at his destination in a condition to serve the intelligence purposes for which he had been captured. She had packed a SAM splint specifically for this category of injury, which was either excellent preparation or the particular alignment that sometimes accompanied very focused attention. She was cutting the sleeve from his arm when he spoke. His English was precise and unhurried, with the rounded vowels of someone who had learned the language through formal instruction rather than immersion. Later, she would learn that he had studied economics at the London School of Economics for 2 years before returning to Iraq in 1998. He used language as a deliberate tool, and he was using it now with complete awareness of what he was doing. "You were the medic," he said, "in the street. October 14th. She continued working. "I had a clear line on you from the northeast position. You ran across open ground to the wounded Marine." A pause. "I gave a specific order that you were not to be shot." She opened the Sam Splint packaging with both hands without looking up. "Not out of mercy," he continued. He was watching her face with the focused attention of someone running an experiment. "A dead medic removes hope quickly. A living medic sustains hope long enough to observe its failure. I wanted you to reach him. I wanted you to use every skill you had. I wanted you to understand when the ones you could not save died that your best effort had not been enough." He paused. "It was designed to break something in the people watching." She positioned the splint along the fractured humerus with both hands supporting the break site and began rapping with the precise tension that immobilization required. Her hands did not change their rhythm. Her breathing did not change its rate. She worked from the elbow to the midshaft and back, overlapping each pass by half. And the technique was exactly what the technique always was, no different for the identity of the person receiving it, no different for what that person had said. He watched her do this. He watched her do it to his own broken arm efficiently and without cruelty, and she could see that this was not the response his experiment had been designed to produce. He was recalibrating. He was the kind of man who accepted data that contradicted his model, which was the most dangerous kind of intelligence. "You did not break," he said. The observation was clinical. There was no admiration in it. She secured the final wrap with 2 strips of tape and assessed the circulation at his wrist pulse. Present, color adequate, capillary refill within normal range. She moved to the rib wound, cleaned it with the same hands, closed it with 3 sutures, which was the minimum required for transport, applied a dressing. She stood. She looked at him once directly for approximately 2 seconds, long enough to complete her clinical assessment, long enough to communicate exactly what she had chosen to communicate, which was nothing she had not already said through the work itself. He looked back at her. The room was very quiet. Then she picked up her pack and walked back to Rutherford, who was sitting exactly where she had left him, with both hands on the hemostatic gauze, watching the door with professional patience. 4 minutes, he said. "I said 4 minutes." She finished the wound. She dressed it correctly. She helped him stand. Outside, the compound was fully secured, and the night was beginning its earliest imperceptible movement toward gray. Somewhere in the city, a call to prayer was ascending its single clear note, and Sloane stood in the courtyard of a compound in the last dark of a Friday morning and breathed the air. Crane found her at the vehicles, loading her pack for extraction. He came around the rear of the truck and stood beside her, and for a moment they both looked at the compound wall in the way that people looked at places where significant things had occurred, taking the final visual record before leaving. He held out his hand. She shook it. He held the grip for a beat past professional standard, which from a man like Crane was the equivalent of a considerable statement. He said, "Your father built something rare." He paused. "You just proved it tonight." She said nothing. He released her hand and walked toward the lead vehicle. Rutherford, being assisted toward his truck by another operator, turned his head as he passed her. He did not speak. He raised 2 fingers from his left hand in a gesture that occupied the territory between a salute and an acknowledgement, and continued moving. The operator supporting him looked at her with the same direct, evaluating regard she had received from all of them since her arrival, the look of people who had been assessing her against the standard that mattered to them, which was not rank or background, but what a person actually did when the situation required it. She got in the vehicle. She put her father's watch on her knee where she could see it. 318. The compound was behind them. The city was ahead. She sat in the dark between 2 men she would not see again after this morning, and she felt the 5 wounds in their various stages of healing and the renewed ache in her left shoulder from overextending during Rutherford's I-FOS line and the settled, completed weight of the night's work. She thought about Warren Fitch's 7 words. She thought about what it meant that he had written her name. She thought she understood it now. The formal debrief lasted 3 hours. The medical paperwork lasted 2 more. By the time she had filed everything, the base was in full operational morning. She confirmed with the duty medic that Rutherford's wound had been properly handed off, verified that the foot fracture had been formally documented, and referred to the unit's flight surgeon, And then she went to the recovery tent and slept for 8 hours. She dreamed about the driveway in Dayton, her father at the end of it in the early morning light, watching her vehicle pull away. The way he had looked without saying the thing he was thinking, which she had always been able to read regardless. The quality of his hands at his father's hands that had shown her with patience and repetition and seriousness every precise and necessary thing she knew how to do. She woke at 1600 with the dream still present in her chest. She reached into her breast pocket and took out the letter. She read it in the flat afternoon light of the recovery tent alone and without hurry, and she did not share its contents then or afterward because it was hers and it was his and it needed no audience. What she carried out of it was a single sentence which she folded and placed in the part of her mind where she kept the things she returned to when she needed to remember what the work was for. She would say it once 5 months later to 14 people she had not yet met. She left Fallujah on a transport aircraft 12 days after the engagement on a gray November morning that smelled of dust and aviation fuel. She carried her medical pack, her father's watch, Warren Fitch's sealed letter for his wife, addressed to the Casualty Affairs Office that would forward it correctly, the card from Kerrigan and 5 small scars in various stages of final resolution. Pruitt found her at the aircraft gate. He had come specifically. She could see it in the way he was standing, not incidentally present, but deliberately arrived, which for a man like Pruitt represented something that had cost him a measurable amount to do. He stood in front of her and worked his jaw once in the way she recognized from the morning of the engagement. "What I said," he began, "before the mission, about you being just the doc." She waited. "I was wrong." He said it without qualification or elaboration or any attempt to soften the admission with context. Clean and direct, which was harder than making a speech. "I needed you to know I was wrong." She looked at him steadily. "You were asking a professional question. It's reasonable to ask why a corpsman is running a clearing operation." "Not the way I asked it." "No," she said, "not the way you asked it." He held her gaze. He nodded once. He stepped back. She picked up her pack and walked toward the aircraft. She boarded, found her seat, felt the aircraft begin its taxi, and watched the base recede through the porthole window as they lifted into the Iraqi sky, the flat rooftops, the blast walls, the particular brown geometry of a forward operating base that had been her entire world for 6 months. She watched it shrink and then disappear, and she turned her eyes forward and felt the weight of everything she was carrying, the visible and the invisible. The 5 scars and the 7 words and the unread portions of a man she loved who was running out of time in a hospital in Dayton. She put her hand over her breast pocket. She thought, "I am coming home. That is what I am doing right now. I am coming home." It was a statement of fact. She treated it as one. 5 months later, on a Tuesday morning in early April, Sloan Carter stood in front of a classroom at Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth, Virginia, and looked at 14 people. They were a varied cohort in the way military classes were varied, different branches, different ranks, different levels of field experience. They had come from 3 different states. They had been selected by a process she had not designed, but which had produced by her pre-course assessments the previous afternoon 14 individuals with functional baselines and teachable skill sets, and the particular quality of forward-directed attention she associated with people who were going to be genuinely good at this. 14. She had looked at the roster number when she received it and held it for a moment and then written the course designation on the first page of her instruction notes without comment. She had told no one about the number. It was not something that required telling. The classroom had a whiteboard and a set of training mannequins in a supply rack along the left wall, and the antiseptic and fluorescent light smell of a teaching hospital, which was appropriate because it was one, and the instruction she was about to deliver was grounded in the most reliable source material available to her, which was the specific and unambiguous education of having been inside the situations she was going to describe. She set her pack on the table at the front. She put her father's watch beside it where she could see it. She looked at 14 people who were going to go to places that had not yet been decided under conditions that had not yet been determined, carrying what she was about to give them into situations that would test every part of it. She thought about what it meant to prepare a person for that, and she understood that the preparation was not primarily technical, though the technical components were non-negotiable. The preparation was about building the particular thing that had kept her hands moving on a street in Fallujah when everything in her body said stop. The thing that had kept her counting, assessing, working forward, always forward, through 5 wounds in 11 hours, in every condition that had tried to unmake her. She had a sentence from her father's letter. She had decided to use it at the start once and let it do the work that right sentences did when they were given to the right room. She opened her mouth to speak. Her phone vibrated. She looked at the class. She held up one hand one moment and looked at the screen. Caleb Whitmore, she answered. His voice was the voice she had heard on a street in Fallujah while she knelt over him with two of her own wounds unaddressed and his life running out through her hands. He was 20 years old now. He sounded like someone who had spent months in the careful patient work of reassembling a body that had been badly damaged and had decided to take the project seriously. "Doc," he said, "I got in." She turned slightly away from the class, keeping her voice low. "Tell me, Columbus Fire Department EMT program starts in 6 weeks." A pause. "I got a letter from someone, Sergeant Kerrigan. He sent a recommendation to the program director. I didn't even know he knew I existed outside of the squad." She looked at her father's watch. "He knew who you were," she said. "Doc." A breath. The breath of someone who has been working toward a particular sentence for a long time. "You told me help was coming. In the street. When I was pretty sure it wasn't." She was quiet. "I'm going to go be the help," he said. "I just wanted you to know." She stood in the doorway of the classroom at Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth, and looked at 14 people waiting for her to begin, and she held the phone against her ear, and she did not say anything for a moment, because she was doing what she sometimes permitted herself in private, letting the weight of something settle fully before picking it up and carrying it forward. "Good," she said, "do that." She ended the call. She put the phone in her pocket. She stood at the front of the room and looked at 14 people, and they looked back at her with the forward-directed attention of people who had come here with purpose and were ready to begin. She recognized this quality. She had worn it herself in every room she had entered for as long as she could remember. She said, "My father was a Marine. He told me once that the job was simple, not easy, simple. He said, heal when you can, fight when you must, know the difference." She paused. "Everything we do in this course is an attempt to give you the tools to know the difference. The technical knowledge is necessary, and we'll cover all of it, but the knowledge doesn't hold without something underneath it. That something is what we're actually building." She picked up her pack from the table. "Let's begin." She taught for 6 hours. At the end of the day, she sat in the parking lot of the medical center on the hood of her car in the April air that was not warm yet, but was no longer cold. The temperature of potential of something preparing to arrive, and she called her mother. Her mother answered on the second ring quickly, the way she always answered regardless of the hour, as though she had been expecting the call precisely when it came. They talked for a long time, about the house in Dayton, about Maggie and Ruth Warren Fitch's daughters, who her mother had read about in the letter that had made its way through the casualty affairs system to Warren's wife, who had written back. 3 sentences. She had read the letter to the girls. The yellow door was still yellow. She was grateful. They talked about Frank Carter, who had died in February in the VA hospital in Dayton, with Sloan beside him 4 days after she had come home from Fallujah. They talked about him the way they had been learning to talk about him, not around the absence, but into it directly, which was the approach that was most like him and which he would have recognized. At the end, her mother said, "He told me something after you called from Fallujah the first time. I don't think he meant for me to share it, but I think you need to hear it now." Sloan waited. "He said she heals when she can. She fights when she must. I always knew that about her. From the time she was small, she always knew which was which." The parking lot was quiet. The April air moved through the open car window. She sat on the hood of her car with her father's watch on her wrist, and his words in her ears carried there by her mother's voice, which was as close as she was going to get to hearing him say them directly, and she held them there and let them be what they were. She said goodnight. She put her phone in her pocket. She looked at the watch. Tomorrow she had 14 students at 800. They needed to learn how to keep their hands moving when everything in the human body said, stop, how to work through conditions that tried to unmake a person, how to carry the weight of impossible choices and still be present for the next one and the next and the one after that. She intended to give them everything she had, which was the only way she knew to give anything. She thought about the street in Fallujah, about the 50 meters she had run and the 5 wounds she had carried and the 14 students who did not yet know what they were capable of. She thought about Caleb Whitmore going to be the help. She thought about her father's hands. She got off the hood of the car. She picked up her pack. She was ready.